June 1950. A quiet peninsula. A line on a map. And in one single morning, everything changes. This is the story of a war the world tried to forget, but for the people who lived it, it never truly ended. 3 years, millions dead, a nation split in two, to this very day. This is the Korean War. To understand this war, we must go back 4 decades to a Korea under foreign rule. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea outright, ruling it for 35 brutal years. Language banned, culture suppressed, resources stripped for the empire's war machine. Then, in August 1945, Japan surrendered, and Korea, suddenly, was free. But freedom did not mean unity. 2 armies arrived to accept the surrender, one Soviet, one American. Along the 38th parallel, they drew a line, a temporary line, they said. It was never meant to be permanent, but temporary lines have a way of becoming permanent wounds. In the north, the Soviets installed a young communist commander, Kim Il-sung. In the south, the Americans backed an anti-communist nationalist, Syngman Rhee. 2 governments, 2 ideologies, 1 peninsula, and both men claimed to rule the whole of it. By 1948, 2 separate states had formed. The division was no longer a line, it was a border. And along that border, skirmishes had already begun. The match had been struck. It only needed fuel. Before dawn, on June 25, 1950, that fuel arrived. 90,000 North Korean troops surged across the 38th parallel. No warning, no declaration. The South Korean army, poorly equipped, badly outnumbered, was overwhelmed within hours. In just 3 days, Seoul, the southern capital, had fallen. Word reached Washington almost immediately. And for American leaders, this was not just a regional skirmish, this was the nightmare of the era. Communism spreading, domino by domino. Within days, the United Nations Security Council voted to intervene militarily, a rare, unified stand. Leading the UN response, a general already legendary from the Second World War, Douglas MacArthur. American troops, still recovering from one world war, were sent rushing into another. Many arrived undertrained and undersupplied, thrown into a war few understood. By August, UN and South Korean forces had been pushed into a tiny corner of the peninsula, the Pusan Perimeter. It was a line drawn in desperation. If it broke, South Korea would cease to exist. For 6 brutal weeks, UN forces held that line, attack after attack, night after night. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the perimeter did not break. Reinforcements poured in. Slowly, the tide began to turn. And far from the front lines, General MacArthur was already planning something audacious. Inchon, a port city with brutal tides and narrow channels. Almost every advisor called it impossible. MacArthur disagreed, and on September 15, 1950, he launched one of history's boldest amphibious assaults. UN forces stormed ashore, catching North Korean forces almost completely by surprise. The landing severed North Korean supply lines in a single stroke. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was liberated. The invasion had been broken. North Korean forces, so dominant weeks before, were now in full retreat. And then came a fateful decision. UN forces did not stop at the original border. They pushed north, deep into North Korea itself, chasing total victory. By late October, American forces stood near the Yalu River, the border of Communist China. And in Beijing, that was a red line no one was permitted to cross unanswered. Chairman Mao Zedong made his decision. China would not tolerate a hostile army on its doorstep. In secret, under cover of night, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed into Korea. They moved without headlights, without radios, a ghost army in the snow. UN forces, confident and overextended, walked straight into the trap. At the Chosin Reservoir, temperatures plunged to nearly 40 below zero. Surrounded on all sides, U.S. Marines fought not just the enemy, but the cold itself. Their fighting retreat from Chosin became legendary, a brutal, grinding escape against impossible odds. Across the entire front, UN forces were forced into a long, punishing retreat. By January 1951, Seoul had fallen once more, captured for the second time in the war. The war MacArthur believed was nearly won had transformed into something far larger and far darker. Through the spring of 1951, the front lines slowly stabilized, almost exactly where the war began. What followed was not the war of dramatic advances, but a grinding, brutal stalemate. Hills changed hands dozens of times. Names like Porkchop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge became infamous. Soldiers fought and died for ground measured in meters, ground that meant almost nothing strategically. In April 1951, President Truman relieved MacArthur of command, a stunning political earthquake. MacArthur wanted to escalate the war, even against China directly. Truman refused to risk World War III. By July 1951, both sides agreed to something almost as difficult as the war itself: talking. Armistice talks began at Panmunjom. They would drag on for 2 more agonizing years. Even as diplomats argued over borders and prisoners, soldiers kept fighting and dying on the front lines. One of the fiercest disputes was over prisoners of war, many of whom refused repatriation. For the men on the ground, the politics meant little. Only survival mattered. Season after season, the war ground on. A war of attrition few back home could fully understand. Back home, it became known bitterly as the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the memory of the last one. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower ran for president, promising to end it, and won in a landslide. True to his word, Eisenhower traveled to Korea himself, seeking any path towards peace. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin died, and with his death, Soviet pressure to continue the war eased. Negotiations, stalled for months, finally began to move. But even in the final days, brutal fighting raged as both sides scrambled for advantage before any ceasefire. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was finally signed. At 10 o'clock that night, the guns finally fell silent. A new border was drawn, the demilitarized zone, cutting the peninsula in two once again. It was almost exactly where the war began, 3 years and roughly 3 million lives earlier. And critically, it was only an armistice, not a peace treaty. Technically, the war never truly ended. Korea lay in ruins, cities flattened, infrastructure destroyed, millions of families torn apart. From those ashes, 2 nations diverged onto radically different paths. South Korea would eventually rise into one of the world's most dynamic economies. North Korea would harden into one of the most closed and controlled states on Earth. And between them, the DMZ remains, one of the most heavily militarized borders on the entire planet. To this day, technically, North and South Korea are still at war. For the families of the nearly 5 million who died, the war never faded into history. It stayed with them. A war that began with a line on a map, and 70 decades later, still hasn't found its end. This was the Korean War. Forgotten by some, never forgotten by those who lived it. This was never just an American war. Under the UN banner, 21 nations sent help. British, Canadian, and Australian troops fought side by side with South Korean forces from the earliest days. The Turkish brigade earned a fearsome reputation, famed for their courage in brutal close-quarters fighting. Ethiopia sent the Kagnu Battalion, hand-picked soldiers who never lost a single battle and never left a man behind.
Colombia, the Philippines, Thailand, France, Belgium, Greece, soldiers from every corner of the globe converged on one peninsula. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and India sent no combat troops, but their medical units saved countless lives. Different languages, different uniforms, one shared brutal winter. High above the frozen hills, a new kind of war unfolded, the first major jet-to-jet air combat in history. Along the Yalu River, in a stretch of sky nicknamed MiG Alley, American and Soviet-built jets clashed at supersonic speeds. Officially, the Soviet Union stayed out of the war. Unofficially, Soviet pilots flew and died in these skies, a secret both sides kept. Meanwhile, American bombers waged a relentless campaign against North Korean infrastructure, dams, factories, and cities. By war's end, nearly every major city in North Korea had been reduced to rubble by sustained bombing. At sea, UN naval forces enforced blockades and bombarded coastal targets, controlling the waters almost completely. Even the harbors held danger. Hidden mines turned routine naval operations into deadly gambles. For Korean civilians, the war was not fought around them, it was fought through them. Millions fled south, walking for days through freezing conditions, uncertain if home would ever exist again. At Hungnam, in one of the most remarkable rescues, nearly 100,000 refugees were evacuated by sea in a single operation. War orphans numbered in the hundreds of thousands. An entire generation grew up in the wreckage of it. Villages that had stood for centuries vanished in a single afternoon of shelling. And in the chaos, atrocities occurred on both sides. Civilians caught between suspicion, ideology, and fear. Their stories are still being told today. Just behind the fighting lines, mobile army surgical hospitals, MASH units, worked to save the wounded within the first golden hour. For the first time in warfare, helicopters were used to evacuate the wounded, cutting death rates dramatically. Nurses and doctors worked around the clock, often just miles from active combat. Letters from home were lifelines, small reminders of a world that still existed beyond the trenches. Many who fought in Korea were barely out of their teenage years, thrust into a brutality few could have imagined. Both sides waged a war of loudspeakers and leaflets too, psychological warfare aimed at breaking enemy morale. Behind the fighting lines, another war was happening inside the prisoner of war camps. Some POWs endured brutal treatment and ideological indoctrination, attempts to convert captured soldiers to communism. Tensions inside camps sometimes erupted into open revolt, prisoners resisting control however they could. When the war ended, tens of thousands of prisoners chose not to go home, a decision that stunned the world and delayed the armistice for over a year. In the final prisoner exchange, known as Operation Big Switch, tens of thousands crossed back to freedom on both sides of the line. Decades later, the veterans of this war are still telling their stories, determined to not let it be forgotten twice. In Washington, 19 steel statues stand forever on patrol, a haunting tribute to those who served. Engraved nearby, a simple truth: freedom is not free. Even today, rare family reunions occur across the DMZ, siblings and parents meeting for the first time in 70 years. And the border remains active, watched and armed, a permanent reminder that the armistice was only ever a pause. The Korean War taught the world a hard lesson, that some conflicts do not end, they simply wait.